The last wave of Fire Emblem Engage's DLC came out recently, wiping out 5 of my grandmothers and burning down my whole street with it. Should have been a bad enough omen, but I went ahead and played it anyways. Having beaten the entire Xenologue, I can say with confidence that this was really not worth skipping 5 funerals for. So pull up some popcorn, grab a chair, and get comfortable as I explain why. Not dissimilar to my parents' marriage, the Xenologue's problems start to show before it even starts. First and foremost, your Xenologue saves are tied to your main playthrough saves. Unlike Three Houses Cindered Shadows, this means you'll have to replay the DLC for every single playthrough you want to use any of the 5 new units or 2 new classes. Now, this doesn't sound too bad until you realize that playing through this garbage once is a horrible experience as is, considering the 6 chapters of the Xenologue are some of the most unpolished, unenjoyable garbage this series has pushed out, which is saying a lot when Revelation exists. So, credit where credit's due. Chapter 1 isn't that bad. It may very well be the highlight of the whole expansion, though that doesn't bode well when it has the strategic nuance and depth of tic-tac-toe, being a very simple kill boss map. But the red flags this chapter raises aren't from the map itself, but rather what you'll notice while doing your preps. The way this DLC handles your items and army are whack as hell. As mentioned before, your Xenologue save is tied to your base game save. This is used for more than just giving rewards after beating the DLC. Unlike how previous games handle their expansions, you neither use a preset army or your own army from your save, instead opting for a bizarre middle ground where the units available and their skills, bond level, etc., as well as available emblems, are determined by your base game save. But their classes, stats, and items are preset. Not only is this more confusing than my sexuality after playing Three Houses, it's also an astonishingly poor design choice that plagues the DLC even from the very beginning, as one look at the stats on your units will tell you balancing for this godless expansion is more thoughtless than my dog at any given moment. This is my dog, by the way. Say hi. The most impactful part of how the Xenologue handles what carries over from the base game is by far the transferring of emblems. Emblems are the defining feature of Engage and massively influence how you go about clearing any given chapter. For better or for worse, the devs were very clearly aware of this and made sure to curate what emblems you had and when and design maps accordingly. I cannot say the same for the Xenologue. Since you can do the DLC at any given time after the first few chapters of the base game, there is no way to guarantee what emblems you will and will not have. This means you could curb stomp the game with an Edelgard Bond level 20 Kagetsu, barely scrape by with just Marth, Sigurd, Celica, and the very poorly scaled Furinese units, or anything in between. And the game seems very apathetic to this little detail, which I'll elaborate more on shortly. Now, back to Chapter 1. You'll probably also notice while doing preps that while you can manage what emblems they have equipped, you cannot trade around Nell and Nill's equipment. And this also applies to the other new units you'll get during this campaign, meaning that at the start of every chapter you'll have to waste a turn at trading around equipment to make the most out of the new units. This is relevant from turn 1, as Nill joins with a restore staff that he cannot use unless he has Micaiah equipped. Though, funnily enough, I think trading his restore staff to someone else is the most use you'll get out of Nill during the entire Xenologue, as he is total deadweight in every chapter he's in, which sucks, because he's force deployed and a game over unit. A nice subtle callback to the good old days of Fire Emblem. Moving on to Chapter 2, a defeat multiple bosses chapter. I sure hope you like the defeat boss objectives, because they're the only 2 in this entire expansion. You'd think that with being DLC and all, they'd use this opportunity to do something more experimental with the maps and add in more unique objectives like escape or defend. Though, considering how experimental they got with just kill boss maps later on, maybe it was for the best they didn't take it any further. Else this DLC would have been even more of a lobotomizing experience than it already is. As for the chapter itself, it is an extremely inoffensive and mediocre chapter for 90% of it, but then it crumbles once you get to that last 10%. See, this chapter introduces the Enchanter class on enemies. And only enemies, of course, so why would the DLC let you use DLC classes? That can give their allies a variety of temporary effects that are not properly conveyed to you at all in true Xenologue fashion. And one of these effects is giving a 30% chance to ignore all damage from an attack. It was endlessly frustrating, having a strategy laid out perfectly to clear the chapter, only for it to be completely ruined because Celine decided to pop her funny proc skill. Or at least it would have been, if not for the fact that the Xenologue forces casual mode to be on at all times. Meaning if using my brain ever failed me, as it tends to, admittedly, I could simply throw my army into the metaphorical meat grinder like I'm recreating another brick in the wall with no consequences. Exactly what I'm looking for in a strategy RPG which has permadeath as a series-defining feature. Oh, I suppose that's a rant for another day. I'd also like to briefly mention that this chapter has thieves as an anti-turtle incentive, even though the writer's bane you get in this chapter won't carry over to other Xenologue chapters, as your convoy is entirely predetermined, making treasure as an anti-turtle completely inane. This is also true for Chapter 5, but I'm bringing it up here as, believe me, Chapter 5 already has plenty to complain about as is, so I won't go into it in detail there. Next up on the chopping block is Chapter 3, which is things really start to go downhill. Before we go any further though, I'd like to read out a little poem I wrote about this chapter. Makaya's hair is silver, like the card. Claude's is black, and he fills me with bliss. I lowered my difficulty to hard, because, seriously, what the hell is this? Dealing with the initial horde of enemies in this chapter is a nightmare. Not only are they just bulky enough to not go down super easily, but they also hit like a truck. What makes this even worse is the introduction of mage cannoneers as an enemy type, which, unlike enchanters, are plentiful and consistently a nuisance for the rest of the campaign. While they don't hit particularly hard, it's still enough to keep in mind when planning out your game plan for the turn. And if that was the end of it, I wouldn't complain, but Brodian military apparently have the worst eyesight known to man, since they consistently have very poor hit rates, but they never get quite so low that you can ignore them entirely, putting you in something of a Schrodinger's mage cannoneer situation, where they both are and are not a threat until they take their shot in enemy phase. But let's say you manage to push through the onslaught of the first couple turns, expertly play around the mage cannoneers, and proceed with the chapter. Odds are your army's looking a little worn down right about now. Probably not the best zone-based wyvern reinforcements. There are zone-based wyvern rider reinforcements. Yeah, revoke my elite gamer status if you must, but this is where I lowered my difficulty from maddening to hard, as I alluded to in my award-winning poetry, because I genuinely could not find a consistent, plausible method of getting through this chapter without one of my game over units dying. If there was one, it probably involved the DLC emblems, most of which I didn't get in my save file, tying back into the problem of the Xenologue being so haphazardly designed, because it's entirely possible that, like, you just don't have the tools intended to deal with the chapters, resulting in a really frustrating experience. But then, once I lowered my difficulty to hard, the chapter ended up being really boring and easy. Almost makes me wish for when games just had one difficulty that the whole game was tailored for, instead of it being practically impossible to find that sweet spot of difficulty. But my Fire Emblem boomer is showing again, so let's move on. You know, the fellow Xenologue may have single-handedly destroyed my business and caused me to fall into an ever-growing debt to the Swedish Mafia, but hey, but look on the bright side. The tool required for Chapter 4 is available to all players at all points in the game. The End Turn command. Yippee! Chapter 4 is the only one to so much as attempt to shake things up in terms of objectives. Yes, it's once again a kill bosses map, but it's a three-way battle where there are two separate enemy factions that will fight each other on top of your own army, similar to the Battle of the Eagle and Lion from Three Houses. However, if you caught that really subtle bit of foreshadowing earlier when discussing Chapter 2, you'll have realized that, letting the Fell Xenologue experiment isn't really a good thing, methinks. The opposite, actually. A not good thing. Now, I'm not gonna pretend that either of the grander field battles in Three Houses were these masterpieces of game design that cured my alcoholism and paid off my debt, but at the very at least you were incentivized to actually involve yourself in the fight instead of sitting around in the corner hitting end turn a bunch of times, because you will get swarmed if you try to, you know, play the game. Since in 3 houses, not only do you get a reward for killing enough enemies, but there's also the simple truth that getting experience points and leveling up your units is a massively important part of Fire Emblem that greatly influences how you play. And your units do not grow at all in the Fel Xenologue, completely gutting one of the series' core features. The map itself is massive too, which Engage is not built for with its typically lower movement across the board. As is tradition at this point, Chapter 4 also introduces a new enemy type. And it's probably the worst one yet, Corrupted Wyverns. I don't know who took the most annoying enemy type from the base game and went, you know what Corrupted Worms were missing? Flight and the ability to spam miasma tiles by both attacking and simply existing. But I hope something really inconvenient happens to them. Like, I hope they put down their plate with the crust of a microwave pizza on their couch, and then it falls down the tiny crack between the couch and the wall, and they can't reach it, so they have to move the couch and then go to the kitchen to get one of those big spoon things from extra range in order to grab it. Anyways, as I was saying, this chapter is pretty brainless, where your safest option is to simply huddle up in a corner, wait for the enemies to kill one of the commanders, which will probably be Tamara. She has a tendency to get herself killed in this expansion. Then let the remaining commander come to you for an easy win. Usually this kind of playstyle is called turtling, but here it feels more like vulturing. Oh well, this map blows. Moving on. Tragically, we have arrived at Chapter 5, which is, thankfully, the semi-final chapter of this expansion that was manufactured in a lab by Nintendo super scientists using a mix of goat blood and broken dreams to ruin my day specifically. As evident in these last 2 maps, which saved the worst for last. This chapter's got it all! Thief anti-turtles that don't matter, mage cannoneers that only exist to be an unreliable annoyance, corrupted wyverns, even a bunch of miasma in one of the last rooms. All of this and more packed neatly into a massive, winding map. Fun for the whole family. Speaking of fun family activities, Nell's stuck in a deathmatch with Nil for the majority of this chapter, which you would think is an easy win given Nil's negative contributions for this entire run. And it would be were it not for the fact that the rat bastard was holding back on me this whole time and has these stats, meaning, yeah, it's one-sided alright, but not in Nell's favor. To make matters worse, Alear is stuck in gay baby jail for this entire chapter, and you can't give them emblems, you can't move them around, absolutely nothing. So you're down not 1, not 2, but practically 3 of your dragon type units, leaving you with just Veil if you want to make the most out of emblems like Byleth. Assuming you even have either of them by the time you do the Fel Xenologue. And not only are they stuck in gay baby jail, but they'll still be targeted by enemies like mage cannoneers and corrupted wyverns, the latter of which just so happens to spawn in right above Alear after a few turns in an area completely out of reach through normal means. Which, as a side note, now is a good time to mention you never get a warp or rewarp staff during the Fel Xenologue, and your rescue staves are only in the final chapter. You also never get any obstruct staves, so that's fun. So the only way to kill that corrupted wyvern, which will kill Alear in just a couple of turns, is to use either Warp Ragnarok or Astrostorm. And the former will effectively lock whoever uses it out of the rest of the chapter, on top of just doing very poor damage against the wyvern. The game tells you to keep Alear healed with physics staves, but going with this route if you don't have Lyn to safely deal with the corrupted wyvern will also lock whoever you put on physics duty out of the action eventually. Since physics staves don't have amazing range in this game, and this map is massive, so they won't be able to keep up with the rest of your squad. As an addendum, if you're playing on maddening mode for whatever reason, that corrupted wyvern will keep respawning indefinitely, meaning you will be forced to keep someone around to babysit Alear with physic. But that's not all. Let's say you manage to eventually trudge through this hellish spiral that I hesitate to call a map, and close in on Nil. Guess what? There's zone-based reinforcements that trigger once anyone other than Nell enters the final room. and these reinforcements will absolutely demolish her and have 2 health bars just in the off chance you get a lucky crit or a well-placed emblem attack or something. What's even better is that if you just so happen to be standing on the tile where the Sage reinforcement spawns, it'll end up blocking off Nell's escape, all but guaranteeing you to burn a time crystal use, which, by the way, you will probably have to do anyways because of just how strong those reinforcements are, and you will not be ready for them on your first playthrough. So you have to go back and then play perfectly, doing super risky plays to get to her in time. And if all of this sounds awful and terrible and miserable, that's because it is. In fact, I was tempted to lower my difficulty once again, this time to normal mode, which, by the way, makes the game basically play itself since there's so few enemies and they're all pathetically weak. But that would require me playing Chapter 4 as well, since it and this chapter have no break in between them, like Chapter 10 and 11 from the base game. So I decided to stick with it. I really shouldn't have, but I'm also nothing if not tenacious, and I wasn't about to let this stupid DLC be what beats me. Speaking of beating DLC, time to talk about the 6th and final chapter. Let me set the stage for you. You've finally made it past Chapter 5, follow Nil to a ruined Somniel, do your final preps while listening to this really weird new map theme, get a powered up Liberation, and you have no way to do now. The now transformed Nil is right there, but due to the fell sigil he's standing on, you can't beat him. Okay, a little weird. But then you notice that there's 7 of those sigils, and 7 bosses other than Nil. A few turns pass, and you're told of Nil's teleporting mechanic, where he'll warp to a different sigil after demolishing the part of the map he's currently on. Alright, killing a boss will cause him to move up, and once they're all gone, he'll warp to the top sigil that doesn't give him any defense spells so you can beat him. Got it. Kind of annoying that the game doesn't really tell you about this, but it's intuitive enough. You split up to take down the bosses as quickly as possible. One won't get overwhelmed with the reinforcements after all. But you soon realize that it doesn't seem like killing the bosses causes Nil to go into teleport mode. Or at least, not immediately. He doesn't seem to be following a pattern either, more like he's just randomly jumping from sigil to sigil. You assume that's part of the gimmick. He'll warp in a random pattern until the final one to keep you on your toes or something. And that there just must be some sort of short random delay between killing the bosses and Nil warping. Pretty annoying that there's so many variables here, but you're used to questionable design choices in the fell Xenologue at this point. You try to kill the last few bosses, but with how Nil's destroyed the map, there's no easy way to reach them, and you're put in a pretty awkward spot. And you still can't figure out how exactly Nil works. You're confused, starting to get swarmed by reinforcements, and this music is really grating you. Okay, this attempt is a bust. You restart the chapter and decide to rush to the top sigil. Maybe he'll follow you once you get to the top? He didn't seem to be chasing you before, and there's no indication that that was what you were supposed to be doing, but whatever. This still doesn't work. The people you're in a Discord call with have no idea what's going on either, and since the DLC just came out, there's no documentation for it online. So you decide to ask around. This is where you learn how the final chapter actually works, and you are beyond amazed at how awful it is. The scenario I described above was my experience with this chapter. And I believe the only way to do justice to just how bafflingly poor the design is would be to put you in my shoes as someone going in blind playing it day one like I would any other game. So, just how does the endgame work anyways? Well, there was one thing I got right while trying to piece together how this stupid chapter works, and it's the randomness. The sigil Nil teleports to is entirely random, so all you can do is run up to the top sigil and cross your fingers hoping he'll show up sooner rather than later. Meaning the final battle of this expansion is entirely RNG dependent. This is probably the most blatantly unfinished and rushed chapter I've ever played in a Fire Emblem game. The nonsense gimmick that just isn't explained to you at all, the weird inconsistency where bosses will drop their S-rank weapons but only on normal and maddening, not hard. This being the only chapter in the expansion to not use the default DLC map theme. It's just a confusing end to a confusing experience. And while I think Chapter 5 is the most emblematic display of the Xenologue's problems, the follow-up's a pretty damn good contender as well. At the very least, with the final boss down, this horrid expansion is finally over, and we're rewarded with Nell, that asshole Nil, and the 3 surviving winds being recruited into the main game, as well as the ability to use the Mage Cannoneer and Enchanter classes on our units, finally. Wait a minute. I played the DLC using my save file that already finished the game, so this whole thing was a monumental waste of time! Speaking of time wasters, how about that story, huh? You'd hope that if the gameplay of an expansion was just more of the base game, but worse, that the writing should at least serve some purpose. But if there's one thing this DLC never fails to deliver at, it's failing to deliver. Much like a dilapidated crack house, the foundation of the Xenologue story is deeply flawed. Being set in a world parallel to the one from the base game, where Alear is dead, the Royals are evil and the Four Hounds aren't. The DLC promises a darker take on Engage's story that flips the world on its head. Now, this sounds all fine and dandy if you manage to look past the sheer stupidity of taking an Undertale AU and deciding to use that as inspiration for a paid expansion to a Fire Emblem game. I can't, but let's pretend I can. But the problems persist past just the setting, and many of its problems are shared with the base game, albeit in a much more compact form. The pacing is terrible for one, with the only plot for 80% of the chapters being a vague get emblems and beat up bad guys, causing it to almost play out like a villain of the week story, where you run into a new evil royal, or royals, every chapter. This would be fine if the royals themselves were in any way well-written antagonists, but with the exception of Celine, who is genuinely the best part of this whole expansion with how uncharacteristically hard her dialogue goes for this game, they're all as flat and uninteresting as the cast from the main game. So, if the alternate versions of pre-existing characters weren't any good, how about those 2 new goobers, Nell and Nil? They're effectively the main characters of the DLC, and credit where credit's due, they're almost an interesting pair, at least till the end of Chapter 4. Nell is introduced as practical, with a cold disposition, giving an even colder shoulder to Alear, a refreshing change from the usual unconditional worship they get. With how prominent her transformed state is, you can very much tell Sombron's blood runs through her, especially when she's revealed to have killed the royals behind Alear's back even after they've surrendered. This contrasts nicely with Nil, who is introduced as much more polite and gentle, and he's incapable of transforming into a dragon, which makes him believe he is weak. The Dragonstone featured in his design is actually Nell's, and she gave it to him, as she believed it was their power to share his siblings, a detail I quite like. Nell and Nil also contribute the one consistently good thing about the Xenologue's writing, the flashbacks. There are several flashbacks throughout the story of Nell and Nil as children, and it gives some much needed insight into what being a child of Sombron was actually like, as well as giving me my favorite scene in probably the entire game, where Nell's fell instincts overtake her and she kills her siblings after they threaten to kill Nil. The aftermath of which Sombron walks in on and basically goes, "Oops, my bad, didn't mean to interrupt." It is the funniest thing I've seen in the game all year. On top of showing us what Sombron was like, rather than simply telling us, something Fire Emblem tends to struggle with regarding its villains. So, what went so wrong at the end of Chapter 4? Well, in a word, everything. Chapter 4's end event is where the bulk of plot revelations are made, and important details are told you all at once. It's an incredibly poorly paced scene, so I'll do my best to break down the events unfolding as they do so. For starters, Nell reveals that the reason she killed the royals even after they had surrendered was because they were corrupted, and that so too were the rest of the world inhabitants, although they didn't seem to know. Already this presents so many questions. How did everyone die? How did they all get turned to corrupted? How did no one notice? More importantly, what difference does it make? If everyone still acts just like they were prior to becoming corrupted, and they weren't even aware that they were corrupted, what made them any different from normal humans? And what made what Nell did any different than murder? Absolutely none of these questions are ever so much as acknowledged, and the scene quickly moves along as Alear says something that reminds Nell of her world's Alear, causing her to lash out and explain in an admittedly very vibrant speech that she was deeply in love with her Alear, and that the main game's Alear reminds her so much of them, and her anger stems from grief. This absolutely ruins Nell as a character for me, reducing all of her unique qualities to simply being a result of her mourning her beloved Alear and wanting to protect the parallel version of them. To make matters worse, this continues that annoyingly incessant trend of incest in Fire Emblem, as Alear is also a child of Sombron. While Nil explicitly states that the Alir of his world was Lumera's own begotten child, this has about as much weight as him saying this about the other Alir, as them being Sombron's child was not common knowledge, potentially not even being known to our Alir, as it's entirely possible to do the Fel Xenologue before that's revealed. And to think, we were so close getting one game without it after so long. Nell runs off, and Nil instructs the winds to chase after her, leaving him alone with the Alir. This is where he unceremoniously drops that he's been hiding his true power this whole time, being able to awaken emblems, and that he also is evil, before knocking out Alir, ending the chapter. I'd like to talk about Nil as a villain to round off the writing discussions. While better than Sombron is in the base game, that is an extremely low bar, as Sombron is quite possibly the lamest villain in the series. Nil is an extremely shallow antagonist with the simple goal of seek power due to his former weakness, which he does via gathering the emblem bracelets. There's nothing inherently wrong with this, as a simple antagonist sometimes works best for the story being told, like Medius and Shadow Dragon. However, in order for a simple villain to work, you're supposed to actually keep them simple, which Nil forgets to do, because while the aforementioned power seeking is all there is to on the surface, it turns out that he was actually being manipulated by Sombron from beyond the grave, as he put evil juice in Nil's Dragonstone to make him evil, and that also Nil died a long time ago, and that the character we follow throughout the story is his lookalike named Rafal, who befriended Nil before he died, and decided to pretend he was Nil to honor his wishes, but also that Nil knew this the whole time, but she didn't care because I guess she liked Rafal, and then Nell kills herself to destroy her Dragonstone, freeing Rafal from the evil juice and making him very sad, even though he was perfectly content with killing her for the past 2 chapters. But none of this has any lasting consequences, as Rafal just gives his life force to Nell and she gets over the whole dying thing after 1,000 years later. And if this all sounds like the disjointed ramblings of a madman, that's because it is. I don't understand what the point of the Rafal reveal is, as it doesn't really add anything to either him or Nell as characters, and it comes across as an unnecessary plot contrivance that it just so happens that there was a different Fel child that also struggled with his weakness, that just so happened to look exactly like Nil, and just so happened to be good friends with him, and just so happened to be there when he died, and Nell was totally fine with all of this. The bit about him being influenced by Sombron just doesn't make any sense either, as Sombron's goal was never to rule the world or be powerful. He just wanted to find the Zero Emblem, which, by the way, is never addressed, even though everyone thought we'd learn about it during pre-release, even though it was the DLC bait from the main story. But I guess that would actually validate the DLC's existence. We can't have that. To make matters worse, everything about Rafal that I mentioned earlier is dumped on you after you've beaten him, meaning on top of only having 2 chapters to be an active villain, Rafal has even less time to actually explore his motivations and backstory, since the game abstains from telling you anything until the game is already over, resulting in him leaving no impact and being yet another forgettable evil dragon. There's more I could talk about with the writing in the Fel Xenologue, like how Mavier's death and the whole final stand of the 4 winds is comically stupid and impossible to take seriously, or how there's no real consistency in what was and was not changed in this alternate world, or how Blue Alir shows up a few times but that never amounts to anything. But to be entirely honest with you, this video is probably going to be long enough as is, and if I were to go into detail with every little writing flaw, we'd be here all day, so let's move on. If I were to describe the Fel Xenologue in one word, it would be atrocious, but if I had to use another word, it would be aimless. I think comparing it to Three Houses' Cindered Shadows' expansion is the best way to explain what I mean. Cindered Shadows, regardless of the actual quality of its gameplay and writing, had a clear goal: provide a more linear, resource management focused gameplay experience separate from the main game, and expand the world through the lore about Citri, Aelfric, and the 4 Apostles, as well as being an excuse to give more interactions of the 3 house leaders interacting with one another outside of the battlefield. Engage does not do this with this expansion, opting for an awkward compromise, making the gameplay nothing more than a worse version of the base games, in a story with no clear goal that can expand the world, as it literally does not take place in the same one. As even when I mentioned before that the flashbacks with a young Nell and Nil were good additions that give Sombron some more personality, that comes with the caveat that this isn't our Sombron. The world of the Fel Xenologue is already dead. Nothing that happens in it serves any purpose in it, as it is entirely unrelated to the actual story of Engage. So what was the point? you could say the pointlessness of the story is the point in some grand meta sense, but I'd say that not only are you giving Fire Emblem writers too much credit, but you also need to stop huffing markers. On top of being aimless, there's a constant rushed, slapped together feel to the DLC due to things like the quirks with the guest units and preps, map gimmicks being poorly explained, if at all, strange inconsistencies. And what really topped everything off for me was that all of the DLC classes, being Nil and Nel's version of Fellchild, Mage Cannoneer, and Enchanter, all have the exact same class bases, with 20 HP and everything else being 5. And as someone who knows a thing or two about the internal workings of Fire Emblem, I can say that this is not normal and a clear sign that there was little to no quality control for the Fell Xenologue. And you know what? I think after having to go through that garbage expansion not once but twice while making this video, I've earned myself an unfinished conclusion paragraph. I'm out of here. Show's over, folks. Go home. Well, that was my review of the Fell Xenologue. Thank you so much for watching this far into the video. This part isn't scripted. This is just like an afterword I wanted to put in. Big thank you to Lando, Bon, Rice. You three know who you are. Appreciate you a lot. You've helped out a lot with making this video. If there's an especially funny joke in this video, it probably stemmed from a recommendation from Lando or Bon. Appreciate you guys. And by the time this video is out, it will either be my birthday or the day before. So that's exciting. I wanted to get this video out around that time because it will be when I turn 18. So I wanted to like, this video is meant to be like a step forward, you know? Like my first proper scripted video. It's meant to be my step forward to, like, I guess just a future I want for myself. So look forward to more regular uploads, not like once a month. I'm hoping to get like 2 videos out a month. I got a lot of ideas. None Fire Emblem though, for the time being, because I want to make sure I establish myself as not being the Fire Emblem guy, you know? But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and if you love someone, tell them. Later.